Hey, good evening. I'm Matt. Welcome to the Artist Forge on compositing and mixed digital media. I am here tonight in the stead of Nicole, but I've got some special stuff for you. We've got, as always, co-hosts Bassam Sabah and Becca Bjorky. Hey, guys. Guess who else I have? Dustin Valkema.
Surprise.
Kate
Dustin.
Woodman.
Amazing.
Boom! We got the pros in the house. Got the pros in the house. Oh, is that not good? Okay. So welcome, guys. It's gonna be an interesting Thursday night. I know, Bassam, you and I are we're laying back and letting Becca drive this car. So Becca, I'm gonna hand it off to you right away and say, what are we in store for?
All right. So tonight we're in store for something a little bit different. I know we've talked a lot about art theory and, breaking down images in general and stuff like that. And we don't usually tap onto the technical aspect of things. But of course, we can't ignore the technical elements and craftsmanship that go into creating art of any kind. So tonight we are going to talk about compositing, both using just photographs, maybe some other elements of digital art in Photoshop, and of course also using 3D. And so we have our two fantastic art friends here, Kate and Dustin, both of who have done a lot of really interesting and very cool, inspired, like fantastical, magical art using different kinds of mediums. So I wanted to bring them in and show their magic. So hi, guys.
Sounds good.
Hi. Sounds good. I guess for our audience, though, can I put you guys on the spot and have you introduce yourselves a little bit?
Why not?
I guess.
Okay, I'll go first.
Kate, why don't you introduce yourself?
I was waiting. You know.
Accurate. Yeah.
I'm Kate Woodman. I am a commercial photographer. I am also addicted to compositing. I think a lot of people don't realize that an extensive part of my portfolio is composite work, but I love it, and I will tell you all about the reasons that I love it a little bit later. But that's the gist for me.
Awesome.
Dustin?
Yeah, so I'm Dustin. Pretty much a pixel junkie and digital artist. I like all things Photoshop and 3D and photography and mixing all of them. Even my dreams are CGI. Generally, maybe that might be. And so I like creating cool stuff and teaching how to create cool stuff. So that's my intro.
I came into this. I know less than nothing about, compositing. Well, I know a little bit about compositing, but I suck at it. And a lot of people suck at it really bad. So what I look in you two, I'm like, and Becca, you as well, I'm like, it's wizardry to me to do that level of compositing and thinking through all the elements of it. So I know for me, it's not only the nerding out on the technical stuff that I really like, but it's practical applications of it, right? So rather than looking at it as something that only a select few can do, I'd love to understand a little bit more how to add it in to kind of everyday work. And I'm talking more specifically on the CG side than just regular compositing in photography. And that doesn't diminish regular compositing in photography. It's just, that's a whole different world. I can put wings on someone. I can't do what Kate does, right? So I'd really love to understand as we go through the conversation, where those levels are for people. What's kind of like first step, and then what's a realistic expectation for how many years it takes to get to this point, so we can understand, can we incorporate it into the business? Can we incorporate it into our art? What are the practical applications if you're not full-time CG, compositing, mixed media, if that question makes sense. So just something to keep in the back of your mind as you're going through the demos. Bassam, what about you? What are you thinking about?
Well, guys, you know what? I consider myself relatively savvy overall. I can usually figure things out relatively easy. I can find my way around Photoshop. I have, quote unquote, some skill set there and probably do better than the average user when it comes to kind of higher level functionality, editing software. But when I watch you guys work, I'm totally humbled right? I watch you with the curiosity and innocence of a child. I watch in wonderment as magic just kind of happens in front of me, right?
Oh, stop.
I don't know how you do it. And for the life of me, I can't seem to understand the basics when it comes to mixed digital media, CGI, 3D rendering, higher level compositing, and all that related technology. So I'm extremely happy to to have you here today, and to kind of looking forward to the discussion. On top of what Matt mentioned, which is the practical end and how it can be applied in our business for us, the average user. I'm curious about the limitation of the technology today. So like, where is that line between what you can do with it and where does it make no sense to use it anymore, where you have to go back to either conventional techniques or kind of look forward to as the technology evolves, what are you looking forward to in terms of where the technology can go, and what is it missing today that you would hope would happen relatively soon or at some point in the future. So more about the limitations, where it makes sense to be used, where it doesn't make sense, and where it's going in terms of an industry as such.
So I think to sum up our questions, tell us everything and anticipate everything that we want to know and just talk about that.
So
Yes.
I think a good place maybe to kind of start at for you, Kate and Dustin, would be how did you guys first start kind of branching away from just photography? So Dustin, I know you've got some kind of mixed, interesting stuff in your background, but what really was that push that got you guys into mixing digital media?
Okay, I can sort of start here. So for me, I started in 3D before I really started with photography. And so it was kind of backwards. Like I learned a lot of my photography and lighting techniques from the 3D side, kind of just starting off. Um, so for me, I used to be into what I would call like graphics, like graphic design, doing album covers, mixtape covers, things of that nature. And I would be doing all different types of image compositing, just Photoshop layering images and images and images, and then would use some very not so flattering ways of making cool text. So like Chrome text. Becca, I know you might hate me for this, but I was like using layer styles and different stuff, things that didn't really look as good as what 3D could. And so I started learning 3D in 2008. I was in a deployment with the Army and was doing learning 3ds Max and ZBrush in that kind of space, and then worked that into Photoshop, which is where I really got into Cinema 4D because it made sense to me from using Photoshop at the time. And just using like their basic at the time, like at that time, their motion graphics software and capabilities were not what they are now. And so I was still able to do some awesome like 3D text, like movie poster looking stuff. And I started to progress with that over time and got into doing product rendering and so on. But when I started mixing it with photography, it was more me needing better than cell phone photos at the time. And so that's where I got into actually mixing photography in with my digital compositing stuff. And yeah, I borrowed a friend's camera and bought some cheap Cowboy Studio lights and a backdrop and went to town. And that's where it really started. And from there, it just constantly progressed. And I fell in love with photography and now mix 3D and photography all the time. So yeah, it's my thing.
So I'm sorry, Kate, go right ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump into my spiel, but if you got a comment, go for it.
Nope.
I kind of approached the opposite side of things. So I started with photography, and I actually started with landscape photography. And at the time I was living in New Zealand, where landscapes are amazing and you could get awesome landscapes wherever you went. And then when I moved back to the States and I was living in the suburbs of Philadelphia, you don't really have the kind of landscapes that you have there. So I completely switched over and started shooting people in studio. And so for years, I had this kind of like disconnect between the landscape stuff that I really like shooting and the studio stuff. And at some point I was like, well, I have to make these fit together somehow. And I tried a lot of like on location lighting and stuff, but the landscapes that I had were in another continent and the people I had were over here. And I didn't have that much access, and trying to get a whole group of people to get together, go on location when the lighting is perfect was like a really daunting prospect to me. And so I thought, okay, well, I have this tool, Photoshop, where I can just cut and paste a person into a landscape and boom, perfect image. Obviously, it's not as straightforward as that, as I quickly learned. But that kind of idea of finally starting to incorporate people into these landscapes is kind of what got me hooked into composite photography. And so initially my journey was very much about like finding things that kind of coexisted and could work together in a space. And eventually my process started to evolve into something that was much more thought out and produced. So I don't know if you would call it a disadvantage or an advantage, but the one aspect of composite photography is it really has to be thought out and considered, and you're matching elements from one scene to another. So it really taught me to think a lot about things like lighting. How do I match lighting in one environment to match another one? And composition, like thinking about where I'm going to put someone in a scene, thinking about, all of these other elements like proportion and camera angle and all that kind of stuff. So I think, this combination of being able to have the freedom of creating scenes that wouldn't otherwise exist, and then this like kind of technical puzzle, like problem solving aspect was really appealing to me as well. So that's kind of how I got started, and what is still kind of compelling me to do composite work.
You hit on something when you talked, about the process, and it made me think of all the discussions we had about visual literacy.
Yeah.
It's difficult enough to get to kind of approach something and to from a visual perspective when you're taking a picture as a photographer, just a one frame picture. Yet listening to you talking, but trying to kind of put 5 or 6 or 7 different elements together, it makes me think of somebody trying to write a book in like 7 different languages at the same time, right? Like just
you bring up a really interesting point, and I think there's a lot of intimidation associated with composite work, whether it's 3D or photography. But we have to remember that like a head swap is composite photography, right? Or changing a background is composite photography. So when you start the process, you don't have to start with something that's incredibly complex. And if you understand kind of the basics of what you're doing, how to like cut out a shape and put it on another shape and like do that head swap thing, which is a fairly basic thing to do in the grand scheme of composite work.
Right.
Then eventually you can take those tools and you can scale them up and you can apply them into a much more complex scene. And, I started super basic and obviously now, do a lot more complex stuff, but it's definitely a progression.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, I feel like, when you're starting from nothing, like once you learn the fundamentals of, matching color, however you do that, because there's a million different ways to do all of this stuff. And so like once you learn the fundamental or the fundamentals, I don't know what I was saying there. That was a good one. Once you master that, it's pretty much like a rinse, repeat, and remix is usually how I like to say it. You just remix like little by little and add more and add more. I remember early on when I was starting with compositing, it was like add everything, like whether it was needed or not, like the fire, the smoke, the like bullet hits on stuff and debris and all like everything that you need. I've realized more over time that it's, like less is more, unless it makes sense, like add things that make sense to your scene. And oftentimes it's been like the most simple composites that I've done that have, drawn the most traffic or been the most compelling for people. Whether it's 3D or, you know, a photography mix, whatever it might be. Yeah. So rinse, repeat, remix. Get in.
I think what I was going to add is, if those of you that are watching at home, if you do have questions as we go through this, just put them in the chat, and you know, we'll be able to bring them on to the live stream here. So make sure that if you do have questions, just list them. We'll get to them if it makes sense, and at the appropriate time. So don't forget to participate. Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Kate, when you were talking about, you know, head swaps and really basic stuff, kind of the world that I live in, I realized that I do the same thing with video as well, just doing compositing in video with motion elements and whatnot. And I'm still not creating my own, but that is a level of composite. And Dustin, what you were saying about less is more, right? You can add all the smoke and the fire and the bullet hits and all that sort of stuff, and it doesn't necessarily add to the image. So you do have to always have this approach that you have the final image in your head and you add bits and pieces slowly. And if it doesn't work, you start taking it away rather than throwing everything at it and trying to carve out of this mess. It's just adding slowly until it gets closer to the vision. Is that generally how you approach it?
Yeah, I find myself even now like adding too much and then like dialing back. Like I was watching Becca work yesterday and I was like, oh my gosh, I miss being like this, because I feel like now, like after so much experience, like dealing with like crazy feedback and different stuff, I'm like, oh, let's go slow. And like Becca's over here creating amazing work and just like boom, 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 throwing it in, like trying things, experimenting. If it doesn't work, it's like almost like a no-brainer, just like cut it out, delete it. And I'm like, oh man, let me sit here and like force this thing to work. Like, I know she's laughing, but it's like, yeah, I get to that point. So, you know, really, like as you're building stuff, I don't know that it's really necessarily like go slow. I think for me, the better option is to have like a really good support system. And this is something that I didn't really have when I was getting into it. And that's really just a place like where you can get feedback from people that you aspire to, you know, to be like, or to create like, however it is. If you need a mentor, like reach out and ask people. That was something that I've always really sought out, was like very harsh, constructive, critical feedback. And so in being in that space, like you're allowed to make mistakes and have more experienced people kind of like rein that in. And like, hey, if you want to, you know, make key art for Netflix, like these are things that you might want to consider in your work. If you want to do these things, like pay attention to this type of flow, or, you know, the way that, you know, the dynamics are working in your shot, whatever it might be. So, you know, really regardless of whatever, you know, creative skills you're using, having a good support system is really good. And that's kind of like really what I have to say about that. Like, I think that, you know, people can develop styles. I think exploring, especially when you're just starting out, do all the things. Like, if you want to add fire and smoke and all these things and you think you can make it happen, like add the things and enjoy doing it, and then have that support system to kind of like bring you back, you know, a little bit. Like in my time in especially the 3D industry, more than any, it would be like, you know, I feel like we've all probably been here where like you go 150% on a piece of artwork, and then after a few different review rounds, the client like dials that back to like 30% of what you had. Those things are pretty normal. And so, you know, like if you can learn to see things like an art director might see things, it makes your professional experience at least a bit better. And then your creative, you know, technical side can also improve from that, because you're not spending a whole lot of time doing things, or like, I wouldn't even say necessarily making mistakes, but like making decisions that are just going to waste your time in the long run.
Yeah.
So go ahead. All right. So on the mentorship thing though, so this is interesting because this something happens to me a lot. Like I get messages from like random people. Like I don't know them. I don't know them in the least, but they're
that was me, Becca.
Huh?
That was me.
That was you? You're just putting your profile picture and your name on making fake Facebook accounts. But I get a lot of random messages from artists. Sometimes they're like, hey, and they have questions. And I kind of like, I admire that initiative to just like message a random artist and be like, hey, can I get your opinion? And I'm happy to give it to them usually when they do. And it's usually something simple, right? But like I know I have felt intimidated by that. Like I'm still kind of like shy, I guess, about like strictly like VFX and 3D spaces because I'm coming from this totally different world of photography, and like some part of me still feels like I'm just a photographer. I don't belong here.
What do you mean just?
I know, but I still like the little baby inside me says that, right? So like how would you guys, like in the case where you have either pursued that yourself or you are approached by another artist for looking for that harsh critique, like how do you guys approach that, or how have you approached that?
Ooh. Well, I did a whole series on photography critique. I think it's valuable to be forthcoming with information. And I try to be constructive, but also positive, because I think there's always this kind of fine line of encouraging people and pushing them forward, but also giving them valuable feedback. And I know for me, that's the type of feedback that I appreciate and value. If someone like shreds my work to pieces, I will, it'll hurt and it'll kind of deject me. But if someone says like, here are some specific things that aren't the best in this image, here's how you can improve that, and offer something that's like tangibly constructive, I think that is something super valuable to me, even if it's not like a ringing like endorsement of my work or whatever, because we all have room to improve. I mean, I'm bouncing stuff off of Becca all the time saying like, I need another set of eyes on this. Tell me if this composite looks like it's working, or if you're seeing something that I'm not. So I think that, that applies to people who are just starting out, but it also applies to all of us who are doing this professionally. And, I just finished a whole week of portfolio reviews. And, I'm like, I've been doing this for 10 years. Like, I think my stuff's pretty good. But still, you're getting feedback, and you're getting feedback from like different people with different perspectives on things too. What an art director is looking for is different than what a gallerist is looking for. So I think, like you said, like getting that feedback is really important. And if you're giving that feedback, give it in a way that is really, trying to really pinpoint like what is the challenge with the image, what is working, what isn't, and try to dial it in as much as you can.
Is the
pretty much
the high
all
level?
of
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dustin.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, is the composite community relatively small, right? Because it's an upper level niche of kind of the photography community, right? This crossover that you guys have, is it relatively small, or like as you're talking about reaching out to certain people, right? Does it tend to be a very welcoming community? Is it a lot larger than I would think in terms of people doing this type of work? I know that might be a really kindergarten question, but I'm just so like, I'm out of this world. So I'm just curious as to, are you guys on the cutting edge, or is it a relatively large community and welcoming, and anybody can kind of wander in and feel like they fit in?
It's a large community. So like there's a million different like terms, right?
Sure.
Like we're composite photographers, we're digital artists, we're maybe matte painters,
that makes sense.
Concept artists. Like in this realm, like there are so many different like specific hats that people like to put on their head, but at the end of the day, like we're all just Photoshop artists that use photography with Photoshop, with 3D and back again. And some people are doing this in, real time and, Unreal or Unity. It's kind of all like put together. So it's a very large, platform. I find, that it's a fairly welcoming community, as long as you're not a dick.
That applies to pretty much any community, right?
Yeah, that's really, that's really how it is at the end of the day. Like I find that, kind of to go back to the last question, like when people reach out to me for feedback, I like the first question I asked them is like, are you looking for like raw, honest feedback, constructive, or do you just want me to say, hey, this looks good? And I asked that question because if you want to deep dive this, like if you really want to learn, I'll say, hey, join our Discord channel, our Discord community, and like I'll pop in for 20 minutes and give you a live critique. Like I'll pull your file in Photoshop, mark it up, maybe show you what I would do, workflows that I would use to do something or achieve a certain look. Like I'll invest the time. Like if you take the time and the confidence to like message me and really want honest feedback, like I can't do it for everybody, and I understand that, but I used to actually schedule like time out of my day to do this kind of thing. I should probably get back to that. But I like to help people. It's something that I wish I had at the beginning of my journey, was somebody to just sit here and like, hey, I'm going to take your Photoshop file and I'm going to tear it to shreds and then build it all back up and then, talk you up. Because like, if you're doing it, the more that you do it, the better you're going to get. Like at the end of the day, like I don't believe really like practice makes perfect, but practice gains experience, experience gains wisdom. And once you have the wisdom, or you're like wise in this space, you can problem solve, which is ultimately like, if you want to be a professional artist, like you have to learn how to problem solve. And that's kind of for me, like where, I look at all of this. And so, yeah, if you have the confidence to come and say that, like, I wish more people would, because a lot of people sit in, like I sat in a very sucky state for a long time when I started, because I didn't initially even have like the confidence to like, I mean, when I just started my first 3D sculpts, I forget what it's called. I might have to put a link, in the group somewhere, to like my first ZBrush sculpts. And like I didn't have the confidence to like go and actually DM people, but I would post my stuff on a thread. And some of that got ripped apart like pretty good. And at that time it wasn't anything really worth what I felt was worth showing, but I liked the feedback. And eventually it just started to teach me thing after thing and learn something new every day. And here we are, like however many years later.
So with that, I mean, so Dustin, you were being brave a little bit on the internet and sharing stuff out there, but like was a lot of the stuff self-taught for you guys? I mean, self-taught including, YouTube University and whatever. But I know like for me, like I didn't know what the terminology was really when I really started wanting to get deep into compositing. Like I knew like photo manipulation from like the era of DeviantArt, if you guys were exploring that realm once upon a time. But it's like I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do this, which was the same idea, but I felt like was something different. And I think finally figuring out like there was this like delineation in the name of things, like finding out what matte painting really was when it wasn't just a big glass plate, like or plate, in front of a camera being painted by scenic artists, or learning the term photo bashing, which is now thankfully commonplace for people's knowledge. But like I didn't even know where to look.
I just learned that term. I didn't know that was a thing.
It's starting to become a little bit more popular, like on like YouTube and stuff. Like you say photo bash or like how to matte paint. Like even if it isn't technically matte painting for film, it's the same concept. And like people don't necessarily know that, especially if they're coming from photography.
Yeah. I mean, I can ask the silly question of, can you define some of these terms for me? Because not everybody's aware of what those things mean. I mean, even CGI, I understand CGI. I know it is. I know it, but what is the difference between, say, CGI and some of the other terms that are used? I don't know if you can give us kind of a quick 2-minute overview of the 3 or 4 major media or technologies or ways of doing things. I don't know if it's a fair question.
No, that is a fair question.
That's the only one I know.
Sorry?
Photoshop's the only one I know.
Photoshop.
On these guys.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like a lot of those terms, I mean, like photo bash, right? Like even in the comments, I only learned about photo bashing from you. I mean, it's what it sounds like, right? It's bashing the photos together. Or, people be like, that looks photoshopped. That's that's essentially what that is, right? It's using digital compositing tools to create something that didn't exist before. And so like matte painting, at least in the film industry, is when you're creating usually scenic environment paintings that prior to digital art were done practically, and then using camera magic made it seem like you were somewhere else that wasn't actually where you were. So now digitally they're doing it with 3D, or still often with even 2D. Yes, darling.
It's kind of like the green screen, the OG green screen.
Yeah, or even set extension. It doesn't explicitly have to be green screen, but yeah, OG green screen. Like here we are in this place that someone painted, and we're making it look like this is what's happening. But those same techniques are then, used in Photoshop. That's how you build these environments often, and it works for if you want to learn compositing just for even portraiture. You can look up matte painting techniques, and it's again the same technique under a different name.
For sure, and
tackle the CGI question a little bit.
Okay, what was the CGI question exactly?
What is CGI?
I guess, is there an umbrella term for what you do, or is it really a mishmash of different techniques as opposed to a specific field?
I mean, it's really definitely like a mismatch. It's a mix of a lot of different things. Because I enjoy doing quite a few different things. I'm a bit more of a generalist in the sense that like I enjoy like say the visual effects side of things, which can be a very specific skill in 3D. Digital sculpting and modeling can be its own specialty, and like lighting, rendering, or like look development, can all be its own specific thing. And so I kind of like to just, cover quite a few things. Over the time, like, over years, I've gotten pretty good specifically in the lighting and materials and, the rendering post-production side of it, which is kind of where like my heart is for the most part. But when it, in the 3D side of it, like just like you have photo bashing, and matte painting, like digital compositing, we have kit bashing in 3D, which is, just taking a bunch of 3D models, throwing those into a scene, creating different worlds and environments using different pieces of different kits and so on. And that used to be done practically as well. You'd build spaceships off of 30 different car models, and putting pieces together and seeing what it could build. And that's the same thing that we do a lot in 3D. At the end of the day, it's not really rebuilding or reinventing the wheel if you don't need to. It's using assets that are already there for purchase. Many are there for free. Just like we have with photography and Photoshop compositing stuff. So
it's so interesting to me, the different terminologies and labels and what people self-identify, because effectively, I mean, you guys are using 3D assets and I'm using photo assets, but essentially what we're doing is the same thing, right? We're putting things together in a scene. We're making the lighting match, the color match, the shadows match, the perspectives match. And I wouldn't even call myself a composite artist. I would call myself a photographer that does composite work, which is, it's just an interesting way of like how we kind of self-identify in this world. And I do a lot of composite work, but there are a lot of like, we talked about earlier about the community and what that community looks like. In the photography community, there are a lot of photographers at like the high-end commercial level that do composite work, but they don't really advertise themselves as composite photographers. It's just kind of like at that level, you're sort of expected to be able to problem solve and to make the image come together in whatever way you can. And oftentimes, sometimes that gets outsourced to a retoucher that focuses on composite work, but a lot of times we just do it ourselves. But the perspective, at least for me and a lot of people kind of at, in my sphere, is we don't really consider ourselves composite artists because I guess maybe one of the distinctions between like a composite artist and a photographer is, and this is a generalization, but composite artists can use stock assets. They can use assets that aren't theirs. They're taking photography from other people or from stock websites. Everything that I do is my own photography that I shoot myself. And then certainly for like commercial jobs, everything is something that I'm going to shoot on set for a specific job. So I guess like there's a bit of a distinction there. But again, all of the techniques, I think, whether it be CG, 3D, photography, the principles are all the same thing. So I think from a learning perspective and like where you go to find out information, you can find it through any one of these avenues. And I think there are resources available in all of these realms. And if you are a photographer and trying to learn something and you feel like you're not getting the feedback that you need by only asking other photographers, go look in a different community, kind of expand your bubble, look within a like digital manipulation group or something like that. Because again, you'll be able to kind of, get the feedback you need from people who are doing the same thing as you are.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I kind of put a distinction between what you described, Kate, which is compositing. Fundamentally, we're doing the same thing. Where I get intimidated or where I have a hard time kind of understanding the principles, the technical principles behind it, is when we're creating something from scratch. Yes, I can create stuff in Photoshop, but it's kind of silly stuff, right? It's not. I'm talking about really high-end, sophisticated, real-life characters that you start with a blank sheet, and then you end up with something. And I find that is different than just compositing existing things together.
Yeah.
Or is it? I don't know. It's a kind of a level of sophistication. I just can't wrap my head around it. And the question is like, how do you start? Like what? And I know it's doable. It's not that it's doable. Having people do it.
Yeah.
It's just very intimidating, right? The
Totally.
creating from nothing.
Totally. And I think the first thing is you're never creating from nothing. So for me, like I said, like I started with the landscape stuff. So I had like a landscape asset, and this is a good exercise for someone who wants to kind of get started in this, is like pick your backplate first. Your backplate is like, it's lit by the sun. It is what it is. You can't change the lighting on it.
Right.
And once you have that as kind of your framework and your starting point, then you can start element by element kind of building up the scene. So you have a backplate, say it's like, a field, and you're like, okay, I'm going to put a person in this field. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to say, what does the light in my scene look like? Where is the sun? What angle is it? What's the color temperature? Is it a hard light source? Is it a soft light source? You're really just analyzing, okay, what's the existing lighting in the scene? And then what you're doing is you're taking that and you're applying it to the subject. So you're going to try as best you can in studio or even outside to replicate the lighting on that subject. And that's kind of like step number one. And then step number two is you're going to find what angle that landscape was shot at, right? So if you're taking a picture of a landscape and you're standing at whatever height you're at, you're standing up straight, and the camera is pointed forward, that's the exact same angle you're going to shoot your talent at. So again, you're just kind of matching whatever that angle is, and lens choice as well.
Right.
So you're going to shoot 24 to 70 or something. You're shooting at 24 millimeter. That's what you're going to shoot your talent at as well. So, and so on and so forth. Like then it gets into kind of like, what are your styling choices? What's your narrative? But essentially, you're really just trying to kind of match an existing thing. So to me, it's not really starting totally from scratch. You have a base that you're trying to match, and you're working off of that. So when I kind of frame it that way, it feels a little bit less intimidating, and it's more just about like assessing what's actually there and trying to learn from that, digest it, and replicate it.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder, I'm going to ask Becca, if you describe what you do, would it be similar to what Kate just described, or in terms of creating from, I don't want to say nothing, but in terms of approach, or are somehow in my mind, it's almost like what Becca does is creating from nothing, right? Because it's all digitally created from what I can see. I could be wrong, right?
I think it really depends. It really, really depends. Because often, at least like, my personal work is created from nothing. But I very much I see it in my head first. So I can't really say it's nothing because I'm not just totally throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks like Dustin got to see me do yesterday. I usually I know what I'm doing or what I want to be accomplished as the end goal. And so that drives all the decisions from there. So even if I don't necessarily have that photographic backplate, I mentally do. I know where my sun is. I know what my landscape is. I know what my weather is. I know what my narrative is. And then I need to fill in the pieces, kind of like building with Legos to reach that final product. Now, there are cases if I am working with photography or I'm working with like live action footage, I do approach very much like Kate does. I need all that information, like even just making a background to fit a photograph. Like I do want to know about lens choice. I want to know how high the camera is. I want to know the distance from the subject. Like all those minute, almost like mathematical calculations that are going to make it more realistic are necessary. But again, it really depends on the project and the eventual final product. But it's never really from nothing. There's always some instinct driving it from the get-go.
Yeah, pretty much all of that. I've really worked both ways in the past, where I've composited, like in-camera shots and multiple of them. And I've created crazy worlds or kit bashed crazy worlds together in 3D. It's really all, at least in my mind, if you're going for something realistic and you're using like a photograph subject, like it's all the same. Like it's really pretty much the exact same process that like Kate might use, like when you're thinking of like how these elements are going to play together. Like if I shoot with a 35 millimeter lens at, a 1.8 aperture, like that's what I'm using in 3D, setting everything up the same way. For me, it's a little, if I'm shooting like Comic-Con events, which is what I do quite often, that's a little bit different because like, I don't know which customers are always going to walk, into the booth and want a photo shoot. And so then I'm like shooting and then on the back end having to do, the research of their cosplay before I create their artwork and do these different things. So that's a little bit different, but all the same. Like I start with some type of inspiration and then I set my, camera and focal length and everything else up the same way that I shot it. I have a general process for myself now that I know like roughly how far my camera is off the ground, like when I'm shooting. So I can roughly like get in, set it up, eyeball it. It looks good. And there are some times where, I just use the 3D tools to actually get in and measure everything and set it up right. So yeah, it's very similar processes, I'm sure.
It seems to me, and we've talked about this on the Artist Forge for a long time now, about the importance of processes and workflows and having some best practices laid out there. And it sounds like from listening to the three of you that there is this general best practice. Start here, then think about this, then think about this. Clearly, the order can change depending on the project, but it seems to be that at a certain level, there are all these boxes that need to be ticked to make sure that it works in the end, right? And if one of those elements is missing, then you can probably go back through and be like, oh shit, I didn't use the right lens when I was shooting the subject. And you get a better understanding of why the image either works or doesn't. But I know you guys have some stuff to show us too. So do we want to start kind of migrating towards that? Or, I didn't want to take away from a little bit more of the explanation, but I know for me, learning by watching, understanding, and being able to make the connections by watching someone do it or talking through an image really helps. Do you guys want to share some stuff?
Sure.
Quick comment to add to that, Matt, and Dustin had mentioned earlier about when you started, you just kind of throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. But I'm also a big advocate of learning by doing. So, watching this hopefully will get you kind of inspired to start your own process and your own journey. But just try everything and see what works, see what doesn't work. You learn so many things by like what doesn't work. as much as you learn by what does. So just go for it and try new things.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so Kate's going first.
I can start if you want. All right, let's see. Present screen. All right. So I just posted, I think I just posted yesterday, a new image on Instagram. And this is, I'd like to say this is a relatively straightforward composite in that I'm kind of working with a couple different layers. I'm working with a foreground layer and I'm working with the background layer, which I'm going to change, and then I'm going to add a person. So when you break it down, it's really only kind of 3 parts to this. The masking is much more complicated just because I'm cutting out all this like stuff in between the balconies, which is a pain in the ass. But, you know, that's just masking, and masking is kind of awful no matter how you cut it. So, and this is just kind of a very quick breakdown of the layers, but hopefully we'll give you the gist. So kind of step 1 is just cleaning up things and getting a color tone that feels, you know, it's pushing in a direction. I'm not quite sure at this point if this is like the exact direction that I want to go, but it's just exploring and trying different color tonalities, and obviously, you know, filling out the left side of the screen, cleaning up the paint that's chipping up top. So just getting this particular layer kind of clean and ready to introduce new stuff here. And then bring in my background here. So by creating my heinous mask, I've been able to add this background scene here. This is the original shot is something I took in Newport, Rhode Island, of the balcony. The back plate is a shot of the Death Valley sand dunes. And I used a 24 to 70 lens for both of these, probably shooting at 24 since I basically live wide open when I am shooting landscape stuff. So, you know, the big question for something like this is, where is the placement of these dunes? And again, I'm trying to kind of match what makes sense to the eye. Like if I were standing at this vantage point, how much over the balcony could I see? You know, something down here wouldn't really make a lot of sense, or up too high. It kind of feels like you're starting to like go uphill and there's a bit of a disconnect. So this is kind of where I decided to place this. And again, like there is some flexibility here. You can move it up and down a little. You're creating this kind of, it doesn't exist. It's a situation that doesn't exist. So there is a little bit of play in like how much you can kind of fool your audience here. And then I decided to really swap it up with the color grade here, go something more like pink tones. Just transporting it into like a different realm. Initially, I thought I would kind of keep it this sort of like gold tones, but I feel like I have a lot of gold, a lot of browns and a lot of gold in my portfolio. So I was like, I'm just going to do something different with this one. And then I decided to add a person in here, and she's sitting on a balcony. I'll zoom in a little so you can see her a bit better. Come on, computer. So when let's see if I can open this. My girl here. So this is shot in my garage, in my studio. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm putting a hard light source kind of from the same direction that the sun is. So at this point, I have all of this built. I have my back plate. I have everything composited. So I already know where my light source is going to be. I know what my scene is going to look like. So by the time it comes to like me actually shooting my talent, like all of that's figured out. So it's really just about kind of matching that here. And so for her, I threw like, I think I threw like a quarter CTO gel and maybe like a like faint pink gel on her, on that main light to kind of get the same color. I put her in a dress that matches the color story of the rest of the image. And then another like CTO on my fill light just to get some of the detail on the back here. And then I literally sat her on a step stool in my garage and put her legs up on an apple box to kind of get the angle of things. And I had to do some wizardry with the legs because they were propped up a little bit high. But that's just like kind of copying and pasting one part of the image and then like rotating her legs down a little bit. And then masking her out so that her legs are on the other side here. So I know I'm making that look really simple and straightforward, but when you really break down the process, it's just these kind of 3 elements. And it's not, it's not rocket science. It's just a lot of patience and masking, really.
So I'll ask a question in there, Kate, right? This is gorgeous. At this point, I know you're probably at like a 60% mark, right? And then it's playing with shadows and refining angles of light, right? And all of the really small details. But clearly this can be done relatively quickly. I think the one question I had is, you build these back plates and then you have your subject come in. Generally for you, are you, shooting so that you have this backplate there present while you're shooting the subject so that you can work angles, or is it just kind of all from memory? How does that process work between the subject, like going from the backplate to the subject? Do you have it present so you can work with her? And
definitely.
I'm not.
Yeah, if I have a finished backplate that I'm specifically working off of, I'm 100% have it in front of me, and I'm doing this to just check, is the angle right? Like the angle of her legs right? Is the angle of her body right? She's sitting on this balcony. Am I like too high or too low relative to this balcony angle? Is the sun coming from the right direction? So yes, I'm 100% referencing the backplate if I have it to make sure that I have to do as little extra in post to manipulate her and get it to where I need it to be.
Got it.
So question, Kate, do you ever find yourself using like, say, like perspective grids or anything in cases where you're lining up landscapes like this? Like in situations where there's like a lot of hills and stuff like this, it can be really difficult to really define that horizon line unless you have a lot of practice eyeballing it. And that's one thing I've noticed in composites often is that when that perspective is wrong, when that horizon line's in the wrong place, it immediately feels unnerving. It feels wrong, and it can often be hard to pinpoint. So is there any particular tool or approach that you use to define that?
My eyeballs.
Yeah.
No, I have done enough of these at this point that I think I have a pretty good idea of what looks realistic and what looks off and what looks okay. I don't know what tool you mentioned, but if that's something that exists and would be helpful to other people, then go on, because it sounds useful.
Just drawing. I don't know if you've ever when you originally if you learn illustration or just like how to draw, right?
Right, like 1 point or 2 point perspective, like in art class.
Yep, exactly like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't do that, but I also have a degree in art history and did a lot of art as a kid. So I think that's already been kind of like intuitively drilled into my brain. But if that's not something you're super familiar with, then yeah, I would definitely recommend trying that out and using that, because yeah, perspective matching I think is probably one of the more challenging aspects of composite work. So especially if you're bashing stuff and you don't have full control over the assets, it can get really tricky. So yeah, whatever tools that you can find to help hack that system, great.
Cool. All right. Well, that's beautiful, Kate. And you did make it look super easy. So screw you for that.
Hey, yeah. Never
Dustin,
mind.
are you ready to be put on the spot?
8 hours of masking here.
All right. Oh, you're muted.
On mute.
Whole mute thing.
Oh, I've been here talking to myself. Hi, guys. Let's see. Share entire screen. Is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something that I shot in my garage, actually. So it was super dark at the time. I usually like to shoot like in black environment. Um, if it's not very controllable, which my garage isn't at the moment. And what we did is we also shot with some like atmosphere and haze, which when you're doing when you're going to composite is probably not always the best idea, because then it's just another element that you have to mix in. But this was actually what I had set up as just my rough perspective lines, like kind of mapping it out in my head before I went to 3D. So obviously I have my subject cut out as, as a PNG, which I would use in 3D to just match cameras and everything like that. Most often I'm very similar to Kate. Like I just get in, I set my focal length and everything in the camera, and then I just line up the horizon lines in perspective the way that it'll look. To where I think it'll look good. There are times where I get part of the way through a comp and I'm like, wait, just kidding. Let me go re-render that like down a couple degrees on the camera. It happens. It's not always perfect. So what I wanted to talk about was not as much, like how I do this, because like what Kate does and what I do and what Becca does are actually very similar. They're just different processes to get, like the assets into our image. And so on the 3D side, for me, I more or less want to talk about some of the benefits like to 3D. So there, when you're talking about masking, that's like hands down what I found when I was doing different matte paintings and stuff in Photoshop. Like I'm like, I have to, like, masking is too much. And so I started incorporating 3D like more into my cosplay photography. And now currently I'm actually planning to go back to doing more photo bashing than going into 3D every time, because the time can get lost here so easily. I'm sure Becca knows what I'm talking about. Once you get into the 3D space, like you just have fun and you explore, like you can do whatever you want. And then at the end of the day, you're like, man, I'm 6 hours in and I still haven't finished this image. And so, so what I'd like to do on the 3D side is just kick out a bunch of different render layers. I know a lot of artists that will just render out what we call a beauty pass, or what would be like our raw photo from 3D, and they'll just composite with that. I guess I just like pain in the way that I like to render out all the layers and then build them up and then deconstruct them again. So this isn't a perfect example of that. But what we have is a base layer that's just lighting information. We can bring some shadows, which in this specific shot are super heavy. You bring shadows in, and then you can build up your lights one by one. So I can render out each of my lights independently and then build them back up on top of one another in the compositing space, which is something that I often do. It's just more or less giving a bunch of control, and then you can tone it all back down and create like that beauty pass. And this is where I have what I would consider my base comp, which is like my raw version that I'm starting from once I start to add my subject and then do all of the matching and blending there. One of my favorite part about 3D is like the tools that you have that you can use. So things like a normals pass here gives you a lot of information to work with. So we can see the red, green, blue in our channels. We have the red channel, which would be light coming from the right. You can flip that so light's coming from the left. We have the top down lighting with the green channel, and then the, I guess, kind of depth perspective or front to back of your scene lighting with the blue channel. So we can use all of these channels to mask off certain parts of our scene and do what I would call like relighting with normals and just making things pop a bit further than what they did in the original. Then we get into a Z depth pass. This one's a bit crunched down, for my normal taste, but you can get like from black or I should say from 0 to 1, or a black to white value, and all of those midtones in between, to really start to pull depth in post. So most often, like if I am working on client projects where I have different review rounds, I won't always render all of my depth in 3D, because if they want a change or something to be a bit more in focus, what have you, like I need to have that access and the availability to do that in post. And so I'll render out a Z-depth pass, which allows me to change it. And then we get to the material ID. So this is where masking, aside of just being able to render a straight PNG, with an alpha channel, this is where things get quite a bit easier in 3D. So this is called a clown pass. This is the material ID. So everything that has the same material is going to have a designated color in your 3D scene. You can do the same thing with objects, to where each object is going to have its own color. You can do the same thing with like groups of objects. And then we have what we would call a puzzle mat, which is where you can specifically assign certain elements in your scene a certain color that you can use in post. But there's really unlimited options when it comes to being able to kick out, ID masks like this, to where we don't really have to focus so hard on just using a pen tool, which we had those whole conversations. I'm not a huge fan of the pen tool personally, and maybe that's why I use 3D. That might just be the bane of my bane of my existence. But yeah, and so long story short, in this sense, we have a bunch of different passes that we can use for compositing and scene manipulation once we get to 3D, or once we get to Photoshop from 3D. And so then in this space, what I'm doing is basically just using overlays. And so, once I get everything turned off, we'll just go to like the base comp. At this point, you can see that now, like in the 3D scene, I've placed certain lights that are just inside these buildings, which are going to be on fire. And so I'm using different objects in 3D to cast light so that I can put overlays on them in Photoshop. This is actually something I do quite often. It just saves a lot of time, because volumetrics like fire and smoke, things of that nature, can be super, heavy in the 3D space and just take up a lot of time. So I'm just layering up a bunch of different overlays, throw my subject in, and then start to add different atmosphere and elements around him, and then building it up with a bit more light, some glow, and then a final grade on top of that. And so with all of this stuff coming together, for me, like this is an area or a space that I probably would have never been able to get to, and shoot. And so the 3D side made that a lot easier. And also going, on Unsplash and, what Pexels, all of the other, free sites can get, kind of crazy. Like you can search longer on those sites for stock images to use than it might take you to go and kit bash in 3D. And so I oftentimes I choose this. Now on the 3D side of it, I figured I could pop in and show how simple some of these scenes can actually get. So if I pop out of the camera here, this is pretty much the entire scene. And everything here is kit bashed. I didn't have to create any of the elements. I just knew that I wanted a war zone looking scene and found some destroyed buildings. Shout out to Kitbash 3D. They got awesome world building kits. But I get in here and I use.
Hey, Dustin, sorry to interrupt, but can you define kit bashing to me? I'm pretty ignorant.
Yeah, so kit bashing is basically the same thing as photo bashing, but we're doing it with 3D models. Okay. It's taking multiple different kits of 3D models. So, for example, I forget the name of this kit actually specifically. They have a few of them. It might be Warzone. Even I believe it's called Warzone or something similar, but it's basically a kit of buildings that are all laid out in a 3D scene, and you can just copy and paste them and move them to create city blocks, or in my case it's just a foreground, midground, and a background.
So those kits are created by somebody else.
Oh yeah, these are all created by somebody else.
Okay.
Yeah, I
So-
didn't have to worry about it.
Yeah,
buy it,
Kitbash
yeah.
3D that Dustin mentioned is actually a vendor. So if you go to kitbash3d.com, they're an online shop and they have a bunch of different of these like model kits.
Right. So I just learned something new. Okay, great.
Yeah, check them out. Check them out. They have amazing world building kits, a bunch of different genres. Yeah, and so this all kind of still goes to that point. Like, don't reinvent the wheel, right? If you don't have to. So for me to say take the time to build all of this, it would probably take at minimum a week, probably a few weeks to like go and piece everything together to where it looked good enough, and probably still wouldn't be as good as these
All right.
were. And so after taking a few of these elements, copying and pasting them around the environment, then I started throwing all of these different spheres in the buildings. And so what these spheres are doing are basically just acting as my, visual representation of fire or the light coming from the flames that, would be replaced with overlays once I get to Photoshop. And so
They're kind of placeholders.
yeah, they essentially just placeholders,
Okay.
For the 3D flames, or sorry, for the flame overlays. And so once we get in, like this is how simple it can be sometimes. And I actually think about, if my camera's not moving, if I'm not doing anything with live action, and my camera doesn't have to move through this 3D scene, I can actually set this up very similar to how I would in, like photography. I can set up my midground, my foreground, my background, everything kind of just works and it's layered up. And then for me, what I like to do is actually just create a bit more separation and really exaggerate some of this so that my 3D render layers, like my depth pass, will actually pick that information up and give me a greater like distance value between them. And so it all really depends on what you're doing, but hopefully it kind of shows that it doesn't really have to be overly complicated. And at the end of the day, when you're looking through the camera and you go and render and then do your post-production on it, you get a pretty cool result. So yeah, there's my my spiel for the day.
Hey, are you following Matt?
Matt's just like
I was almost muted. No, it's a lot less intimidating now, just seeing it, right? Just thinking through it, like seeing 3D. So 3D was super intimidating for me. And now that I've kind of understood and can make the analogy to what Kate does, which is a world that I'm much more familiar with, like, oh, it really starts to make sense. It doesn't mean that I can do it just yet, but it's a really good understanding of it can be that simple. And then it just comes down to how good are your skills at the nuance and the really, really fine details. But to get from, 0 to 80% seems relatively straightforward. It's that last 20%, that last believable, the polish, the lipstick on the pig, whatever you want to call it. That's the stuff that really makes the image. And nothing creates that but experience and trying over and over and over. Right.
Yeah, and I mean, and there's definitely times, like where, with that experience, like you start to learn like what you need to spend that time on and what you can essentially like shortcut. And that is for me at least 100% experience. Like I used to spend so much time like perfecting and polishing things just to have it torn apart in feedback that I feel like I eventually learned like, hey, like you do this and let them call out certain things, when you're dealing with, say like freelance clients or things of that nature. And with my cosplay stuff where I have complete, creative freedom, like I can just go as crazy as I want, or, less is more approach and really make it impactful that way.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to watch. And I was curious, just to tie into some conversations we've had in the past, with all of the advent of AI coming out, is it making your job easier to do things, Kate, like masking, or Dustin to create, some of these lighting setups? Is AI assisting with that, or should we not even and get into that conversation right now.
I have not touched AI, so I have no idea.
Got it.
I will jump in and say, sorry to, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I just wanted to say that I don't use 3D significantly. I have opened up a couple things. Becca helped me with a client job actually, where I rendered something in SketchUp. It was I was putting together a treatment for a job. I needed to get like a visual representation of what the set that I was building was look like. So I built a set in SketchUp, and then put it into Blender and lit it so that
Nice.
I could demonstrate to my client like what this is going to look like when I light it. So I think, even if you're not interested in becoming an exclusively like CGI artist, there's still applicability for photographers. And I think having just kind of like the basic understanding of how that works, there are certainly instances where it can be a valuable tool to show clients how things are supposed to look, or to give you a sense for like, okay, I have the scene, how am I going to light it? And if you have an ability to kind of mock something up, even if it's super simple, and in a program that lets you put lights in different places, that can be super valuable to you and can kind of take away some of the pre-production elements of a photography shoot, which is great if you're short on time or if you need to like really dial something in quickly.
Yeah, I think.
I mean,
Is it Light-A-Set that is very similar to that? Is that the application where you can move around like basic photo studios? And
that's mostly for people, or is it Satellite?
Satellite. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great if you want to kind of mock up on a person, like how the light is going to affect their face. It doesn't really let you do any kind of like set elements or any kind of like big thing. But on a person, it's a great mock-up program.
Yeah. So yeah, there's Dennis's comment. It's talking like AI, it's here. So like Becca and I just had this conversation yesterday. I'm personally excited about it. Like there's aspects like you have a choice, right? You can sit and be scared and be ornery and angry about the fact that AI is here, or you can learn how to use the tool because it's not going away. I've been using select subject, like Dennis, commented, like I've been using select subject, and that's like expediting a bunch of workflows. Like I said, I don't like using the pen tool personally. It's not a thing. If I can get away with select subject on the full model, great. If I can do it on part of the model and then, go through like different, like rigorous, masking techniques on other parts, great. For me, like as a cosplay photographer, like if I'm not doing personal work and I'm doing customer work or client work, I may use AI to generate a background, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then I can add to it, do paint overs, do different things. But as an artist, I hate to say sometimes like time is money, but it really is. Like if I want time to be creative and do my own projects, I have to find time to find a way to expedite, my processes. Luckily, things like Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, DALL-E, like they're all here and they're like expanding every day. And so, I don't really think that it's hindering things. I think that we can, like you can leverage that, even if it's just creative concepting. Like I have come up with 3D ideas and stuff just typing in a random thing. I think I actually typed like blah into it, like as one of my first prompts. And it was like, holy crap, this is like crazy stuff that popped up. But wherever you can get inspiration these days is never a bad thing. If you want to use it and you can hustle and you can sew prints of like AI stuff, like it's tough. Like the same type of thing happened when like the internet, became a thing. Everybody's like, oh my God, the internet, this and that. I'm like, here we are. And Blockbuster went away. And then Family Video went away where we're at. I don't know if it's called Family Video, but all the little video shops and, as all this stuff started coming, like it's not going away. So you can change your approach and the way that you look at it, or just don't use it. and but like you can't be mad at the results of an effort you didn't put in to like learn the thing. So get in, learn about it. If it can help you out, use it. If it doesn't, then don't use it.
Yeah, I think
to Sam's point, you're talking about this intimidation of creating something from nothing. If you have an AI prompt and you have an idea in your head and you want to kind of get visually a little bit closer than what what is just going on in your head and put something on paper, then that could be a great starting point. And you could make something that looks very close to that. You can make something that looks different, but it's kind of inspired by it. So anything that can help you kind of translate the ideas in your head quickly into a visual element. I mean, why not?
Yeah, and I experimented quite a bit with AI, with creating backgrounds and I even created my ideal studio, for example, with certain windows and lights coming in. So I did have fun with it, and kind of in the process of thinking, how can I incorporate it? Because I do some compositing, Kate. I mean, I do same process that you do. I'm an amateur at it, but I have experimented with it. It's really that 3D world and that creating that rendering and creating from, I call it from scratch, but it starting with an image, right, or a backdrop or so on, it to me is not creating from scratch. But when the buildings you showed us, Dustin, somebody created those from scratch, right? From a digital perspective, from a technical perspective, they were created
right.
Digitally, and that's really the intimidating part to me.
Yeah, and
patching stuff together is less intimidating, right?
And you can totally do that in 3D. Like if I have to go in and make something, I will make something. Like I know enough about the modeling tools, the 3D modeling, like building something from scratch. I know enough about digital sculpting that like if I have to get in and make something workable, I can do that. But like I tell people all the time when you're getting into 3D, like don't even like if you don't have like a passion or like a real urge to like get into 3D modeling and you want to get into 3D for photo composites, learn how to kit bash. Like there are tons of different models out there for free. Go to Sketchfab, sketchfab.com or org, one of the two. You can find a ton of free models on CG Trader, free3d.com. Like there's all kinds of places. Get those and use them. Learn how to light, learn how, to apply materials and start to make those workable, and learn post-production in Photoshop. Like it's really not nearly as intimidating when you take like the creation from scratch out of it, because oftentimes that's not really needed. There are times like doing fantasy work for sure. Like you need horns and different things. And, Becca's like, I just use whatever. I forget. What is it now? Daz? Like an amazing freaking software. She's like making characters like just, I'm like, blew my mind. Anyways, but
I mean, even within within 3D software, like I mean, maybe you can speak to this from C4D, but like even in Blender, like you have your basic kind of primitive shapes when you want to start modeling, right? You got like your cube and your sphere and your donut shape, but I mean, there's like stuff that's built in that you can mathematically like generate, like procedurally generate really cool textures, really cool shapes without having to actually go in and like piece by piece model them or sculpt them.
Yeah.
Like so in Blender, for instance, there's a landscape generator tool, like a plugin that you just have to turn on. And then you got mountains, and then you got a lake, and then you've got, basically an environment where you don't really have to know about modeling or sculpting, and you can still have these shapes established for you, and you can render them, just completely gray, just to, maybe photo bash over, or you can go in and you can texture them and light them, and then you have a 3D scene. And it really took a very minimal amount of know-how to do that. So it isn't as intimidating, I think, as it can seem when you first open a program, for sure.
Yeah. Like get started. 100% get started. Like dive into it. Like the hardest part about 3D is going to be the exact hardest part from moving from Lightroom to Photoshop. Like it's literally the intimidation of the software, learning new lingo. There's more panels, more buttons, more things are in different menus and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, like it's just a software. I mean, and then, like, to be fair, there are software that I look at, I'm like, no, like I have no reason to learn that. Like, it's not even gonna happen. Like there is an intimidation factor, but most of that intimidation is just learning something new, rather than thinking like, oh shit, like what if like I can get in and do something cool with it? Because I promise you, like you have one win, one small win. Like take the smallest little, like you put a light in there and a camera and this and that, and you render it, done. That's your first win. Like on to the next one. And then you rinse, repeat, remix, and years later you'll be a badass. And you're like, yo, I don't remember starting. Like, when did all this happen?
Hey, so I know you both teach quite a bit and you've developed courses and whatnot. Can you plug a little bit here? And I'll start with you, Kate, just so that people can start to take a look at this. And, if they're interested in learning what you do and want to see what you do, you want to plug, where can people find you? Where can they find courses?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, I don't have too many courses that have to deal with compositing specifically, but I have a lot of stuff dealing with lighting and color, which are obviously very critical elements. So I have 2 classes with Pro EDU, one on narrative photography and one on the science of color. And then I just recently released a course through Class 101, which is about creating high production photography on very small budgets, which is always great. And again, part of why I got into composite work is because it's really a great way to kind of save costs when you can't go to that location, or location doesn't exist, or you can't get a model, up a mountain. So yeah, that's my shameless plug. Oh, and maybe something more relevant to compositing, but I do sell backdrops, digital backdrops, which are super fun. They're a good kind of like gateway into composite work, because it's just like replace your backdrop with this one. So yeah, those are at thebackdropstudio.com.
Okay. And what's your website?
It's katewoodman.com.
Perfect. Dustin, how about you?
Yeah. So I actually just started a new company that launched this year, CG Hacks. So it's cghacks.com. Becca, I don't know if you can just put it in. I don't know where this whole chat is, so that's a pretty cool feature. But yeah, we sell like premium VFX overlays for Photoshop. So kind of all really inspired by Hollywood. All the cool stuff there, and 3D assets as well. And we're actually in production with a few really cool courses that are going to help out with the beginning to CGI and also Photoshop compositing, and getting into that space. And we have a really cool Discord channel that is like all wrapped around, kind of feedback hangouts. We do creative hangouts a couple times a week where, myself or one of the team members will go in and we just sit and hang out. People have questions and we answer questions, or we just create art, or we watch Becca create art like we did yesterday. Like we just sit there and chill. So we get into that space. We have a pretty cool challenge going on right now, which actually ends in 3 days. So if anybody wants to join in. It's super cool. But yeah, that's what we do. And that's where you can find us and stay updated.
Brad, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Becca.
Hi.
Hi. So as we're kind of getting here, right, we're a little bit over time, but I could sit here like you guys did yesterday for 5 hours and just keep going on this. But this body's not going to let me do that. I'm going to fall asleep in about 11 minutes. So as we kind of wind this down, and, my mind's already racing with things that I can do and bring it into my business and how I can do some of this stuff and start playing with it. So, because I needed another hobby. So there goes all the expendable income. Is there any question that you have that we haven't covered for this group, to kind of sum it all up?
Yeah, so I think maybe if we cycle back to the very beginning to Bassam's question, actually, I think is kind of a good closing sort of question. Where would you guys recommend, making that decision? And Dustin, you kind of just pushed on this too, about just jump in. How do you know when you need to learn compositing, and what should be that first step that everyone should go take after they close out this video?
If you wait until you need it, it's too late.
Good advice.
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
That's what I would say. 100%. Like knowledge, like I would rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And I run into this in our field too, in 3D. Like there's plenty of this, right? So, you know, it's tough. Like I wouldn't wait until you think, hey, I might actually need 3D for this, because one of two things is going to happen. Like you could totally do the work if you knew 3D. Like it might be simple enough you could actually execute it, and then you're going to be pissed at yourself because you're like, man, I could only, if I only knew how to use the software. I found the kit, I found this thing, I found whatever, and you're just like, I can't do it. And then you're going to pay somebody else an exuberant amount of cash to be able to do the thing. And it's going to be super simple for them. I mean, I've been the guy that people have hired for that. It's like, you know, like at the end of the day, like don't wait. It's super fun. Yes, it is a rabbit hole, just like Photoshop's a rabbit hole, just like photography is a rabbit hole. But definitely get in, start learning the software, surround yourself by people that are better than you, and you'll grow. Because what you'll realize is that like it's all a journey. You know, like I look at Becca's stuff and Kate's stuff, and I'm like, man, let me just sit back in my little corner over here, you know, we just kind of chill, see, and then they're like, oh, stop it, you know. But like at the end of the day, like we're all at different parts of our journey, and like what you realize is that people that you look up to are a lot cooler than what you actually like really mentally would think they are. So when you go and you start to hang out with them, you know, I tell my kids this about, you know, their parents, like we're actually cooler than you think we are once we get there, you know. But like, you know, like we're just people at the end of the day. Like you're an artist, you can learn, you can dive into something, and like in a few weeks start adding it to your skill set and your cash flow. Like it's really not, it doesn't always have to be as difficult as you think it is.
Yeah.
I would just like to say that I am not cool at all. But thanks, I guess.
Just roll with it.
I was just a giant nerd. I guess the only thing that I would add to that is from the perspective of a commercial photographer, there are many, many times that I'm asked, can I do this? Is this in your wheelhouse? Like, this is how we have to approach this. A great example is I shot a job 2 years ago for a COVID vaccine. And because of that, the protocols for like COVID were so high. So we had to shoot 10 different talent, and we had to shoot all of them separately. And they were all sitting around this table, and they were all like engaging with products on the table and like they had to interact with each other. And so had I not had any background or skill in composite work, that would be extremely intimidating, maybe not even possible. But because I had that in my wheelhouse, I could just be like, yeah, that's something I totally can do. Here's how I'm going to approach the job. Give the customer and the client confidence that this is something that I am capable of. Show them, you know, examples of things that I've done. So I think, you know, eventually, if you guys are working photographers and you're working towards commercial work, you know, regardless of what sector that's in, at some point you're probably going to be asked to do something along these lines to varying degrees of complexity. And so, like Dustin said, if this is something that you've practiced before, even on your own time, not necessarily for, you know, a job or something super complex, but you at least know the tools and you know how to apply them, then you can extend that into client work so that when someone does come to you and say, can you do this? You're like, hell yeah, I got this.
Yeah. And like two things. So like photographers have a cheat code. Okay. Like it's being a photographer that is the cheat code. So when you're getting into 3D, like, and I say this all the time and I'll swear by it, like if you're a photographer first and you go into 3D, you already are like up there. Like, so that's number one. Number two, don't forget your prior knowledge when you're getting into something new. like especially from photography to 3D. Like if you understand lighting, you understand composition, you understand storytelling, you understand, maybe Photoshop retouching, color grading, whatever it is, like literally sit down and write all of your different skills and then like keep that, like make sure you read that every time you open up a 3D software, because that's going to like remind you that you're a badass and you know all of these things. So when you hit a roadblock and you're like, oh my gosh, the software is crazy, like it's really not that big of a deal because you've already conquered all of these other things. So like keep a cookie jar next to yourself on your desk and pull from it every time that you hit a roadblock. It'd be good.
I like cookies.
I like cookies too. Yeah, cookies all day. Peanut butter Oreos, what's up?
Nice.
Peanut butter, anything really, for that matter.
True story.
So, guys, this has been amazing. I really, really appreciate both of you coming on. I know I can speak for Bassam, and we're just gonna have our minds blown for the rest of the evening. Again, I think this is a world that, like you were saying, Dustin, if it's coming, it's here, right? Either start using it, start learning it, or basically get left behind. So, even if dabbling in it gives you a better understanding of what you can do and what you can't do, at least you're on the playing field, right? You're in there, you're learning about it. And it may not be for you, or it may be the thing that is the final puzzle piece to your business or to your art. So why not play with it a little bit? It's I know for me, after tonight, it's a lot less intimidating. I've tried to watch tutorials and classes and whatnot, and it just blows my mind. So yeah, thanks for making it so approachable and for giving us a lot to think about and how we translate photography into, or stepping up the game, really, not translating it into anything, just stepping up our game. So I really appreciate that. Bassam, Becca, do you have anything else you want to add?
Kind of build on what you said. I want to go back to what Kate said. You don't have to you don't have to jump up the flight of stairs all at once. Like take step number one, the simple step of compositing two things. I mean, basic background removals and replacement. And it's just that step-by-step approach where you gain confidence as you go up and build on what you learn. So I really appreciate the simplicity with how you explained it. And again, I also appreciate, Dustin, your last point about don't lose what you know already, right? Like example, I just got into video, and it's so easy to see the similarities between editing video and editing photography, and the concepts of, I just realized that my video, this sounds silly, but I just realized that my video software, I can do blend modes like I do in Photoshop, right? And I didn't realize because it's called something else, and it's a complicated name that I don't understand. When you find it, oh yeah, I got it. That's simple, right? So you're right. It should not be intimidating. Build on what you know already. My next challenge is to kind of find those similar concepts in doing audio, because but I'm sure they exist, and it's probably the same concepts, right?
Oh, you have filter and layers of audio and different stuff. Like, yeah, there's plenty. Like, you can probably make a correlation in there pretty
exactly. So that kind of hit the chord with me, that there are similarities, and if you approach it from that perspective, it is less intimidating.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I've been like yelled at for saying it, but like ultimately, like when you're thinking like of CGI in photography, has been specifically like product photographers like don't like to think of CGI photography as a thing, but it's really the same. Like we both click buttons to take a photo. For me, it's a render button. For a photographer, it's a shutter. Like we're clicking buttons, but everything that goes in before that and everything that goes in after to make that shot come together, we're doing the same thing. We set up lights. I mean, we do have to set up materials and stuff, but we set up lights and backgrounds and props and all of that stuff in 3D, get it all looking good, and then we click our render button, and then we go to Photoshop for post-production. A lot of the processes between 3D and photography like really do make a whole lot of sense. And when you break them down to what they actually are at their core, like it's almost spot on, just a little bit different in the technicalities. So
very cool.
Yeah.
Becca, anything from you?
Yeah, I'm just So grateful that you guys were willing to join us and make Dustin stay up way late at night and ignore his family or whatever he's doing right now. But I loved having these opposing kind of industry viewpoints. You know, obviously, Kate, the work you do is wildly different than the work that Dustin does. You know, and that's very different than the work that I do, and Bassam and Matt as well. So, like seeing these correlations, I think is really helpful, and that's also then how, as each of us individually, are going to go out there and like pursue our own individualized learning, like seeing that it's not so scary, it's not so different. You know, it's really helpful, and so I'm again very grateful that you guys were able to join us tonight.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Quick thing on that. I think it's just, you said all our work is very different. And I think that kind of drives home the point that they're just tools, right? And you can use these tools to create something that fits your style, your aesthetic, your process. So don't feel like, if you start doing composite photography or CG, that it's going to look a certain way. So it's all applicable to you, and you can make it fit whatever works for you.
Good point.
100%. Mic drop.
Oh, there it is. All right. And that's the perfect way to end it, right? On something like that. So, guys, everybody out in the audience, thank you for hanging with us for so long. I know we're way over, but I love these kind of extended, kind of casual conversations. So thanks for sticking with us for so long. Remember, on Monday, we will all be back. Kate and Dustin, I'm sure, will clear their schedules and just tune in to watch us. But we're going to be meeting again at 3 p.m. Eastern time on Monday. Tune in. We'll be doing our live, me and Bassam and Becca and Nicole and Kat. We'll be talking about something. I don't know. We'll figure it out over the weekend. And it'll be noon on the West Coast. And if you're in Malaysia, it's some other time. But feel free to tune in. As always, thank you so much for joining us, for being part of this community. We couldn't do this without you. We wouldn't do it without you, because we really don't like each other all that much. So tune in, and I'm sure we'll have some kind of great debate on Monday about something. Maybe AI. Who knows? Because we never talk about that. Not again. I know. Not again. It's not going to happen. I promise. All right, guys. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great night, and we'll see you all on Monday.
All right. Sounds good. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.